Hi, I'm Sarah Pulaski, and this is my video for chapters 1 through 6 of Born in Blood and Fire. I found this book really interesting thus far, and I think that even if one doesn't understand all the intricacies of Latin America and the histories of these countries, it's clear to many people that this region is filled with rich cultures and fascinating civilizations, both in a historic and a more modern sense. But let's dive into this more historic view here. So Latin American countries have similar pasts of conquest, colonization, and independence, and so these shared experiences have really united the region. However, each Latin American country has its own unique cultures, global positioning, social structures, and so on, which really sets apart each country from each other. So Latin American countries are united by their histories with European colonization, and they face similar economic and political ramifications from this event. So, right at the encounter, when Europe first introduced itself to Latin America, the indigenous way of life was completely turned upside down. So, European lifestyle and social norms were forced upon the indigenous people, and so this was things like gender norms, the introduction of the patriarchy, and religion, Catholicism. Sorry, I said that weird, Catholicism. Um, so, indigenous societies were subjected to violence and often forced into slavery, and so this often led to death. And then something that more intensely led to a lot of death was the European diseases that the indigenous people had no immunity to, and so this had really devastating effects on the populations of this region. So, a more social ramification from the introduction of Europe to this region was hegemony, which was something that really slowly took away those Latin America cultures, the indigenous cultures. So we saw hegemony through religion. So the implementation of Catholicism in Latin America. Catholicism has a lot of standard rules and practices like tithing, and even things like the 7-day week with the Sabbath on Sunday was just completely different to what the indigenous Latin Americans were used to. Another way that hegemony was introduced to the region was through the patriarchy. So Spain and Portugal were very strictly patriarchal regions, and this was quite different from the indigenous way of life. So the patriarchy really contributes to the idea of honor, and so this is like men and women acting as they're supposed to in their lives. And this really is seen in sexual ethics. And so this is quite different, Spain and Portugal versus the indigenous societies, because women are really expected to be pure and like only have like one partner and no children outside of marriage and so on. And so indigenous women really resented this treatment and this expectation to kind of be subservient. And so women often revolted against this, but they were punished, and this was really seen during the Spanish Inquisition. And so then comparing core areas to fringe areas with this introduction of hegemony, core areas saw it more through colonial governance, while fringe areas saw it more through religious missions. And so, as one might pick up on, the indigenous people really didn't like colonization, and so we saw some colonial rebellions. A lot of colonial revolts were actually very small and isolated events that didn't have a huge effect, but we did have some that stuck out. And so, one thing that really characterized these rebellions was how harshly they were punished. So in the book, we read about how one of the leaders was literally torn limb for his participation in the rebellion. And then something that also characterized the rebellions was how they were able to temporarily unite people of different castes. So as we know, there's a very strict caste structure in Latin America based on race, and so when these rebellions would occur, there would temporarily be like people crossing these lines to work together. However, this usually only lasted for a few weeks at most. And so as we move more towards independence, something that really set the stage for this was the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So Napoleon imprisoned the Spanish king in 1808, I believe, and this really set the stage for independence in Spanish America. The story was a little bit different in Brazil because the Portuguese crown had a really close relationship with Brazil, and they had like a good relationship with England, and so they actually stayed quite peaceful throughout the Napoleonic Wars, but it was a totally different story for the rest of Latin America. Spain and Portugal both fell to Napoleon, and so then there was a lack of like legitimacy in a ruler for the territories in Latin America, and so they began to experiment with things like popular sovereignty and self-governance. And so even after Spain and Portugal regained the territories, this was something that stayed with the Latin American people, and they really wanted to have independence after the Napoleonic Wars. Um, and then something that also contributed to the push for independence in Latin America was the liberal ideas from the French Revolution. And so in the French Revolution, we saw people wanting to have view the legal equality of all people. That's the idea of liberalism. And so the French people kind of demonstrated this by questioning traditional authorities of the king and the queen, and then also by demanding popular sovereignty. And so this idea of popular sovereignty made it to Latin America, and it made them desire independence. And it was really the Spanish liberals who led and wanted the Latin American wars of independence. And so after gaining independence, there were a lot of difficulties in the region, as is often seen after independence. We saw economic failures. There were things like mines closing, infrastructure failing, and interest rates also skyrocketed. Um, in a more political sense, we saw a return to conservative hierarchies because the liberal ideologies were so difficult to implement without a stable government or stable economies. Excuse me. And so these governments were very fragile, and there were a lot of corrupt politicians. However, despite these political changes, we did see some cultural patterns that were able to survive past the colonial days. So we saw indigenous people continue to farm on communal lands, and some places even had indigenous governments that were able to continue to rule themselves. Indigenous people were able to practice their cultures more openly, and this was seen especially through cultural dances. And then people also found pride in their identities, and this was especially seen in the nativist spirit, which remained strong for a couple more decades. And so past independence, we saw progress with a capital P, as the book said, and this became a hegemonic idea in Latin America. So progress was introduced after the liberal comeback in the mid 1800s, I would say, and this was after people started seeing the faults in the conservative ideas and viewing progress as something that was possible and even positive. So as the Industrial Revolution transformed the international markets, many Latin Americans really saw that progress was something that could benefit the region. Progress began to spread across Latin America, characterized especially by technological and transportational advancements, and progressive ideas began to replace traditional values. Thus, progress became a hegemonic idea in Latin America. However, despite all the benefits of progress, few women saw improvements from this movement. Especially, I think, most disappointingly in education. A lot of women still couldn't get a good education, despite how much other stuff was becoming so much better due to progress. So yeah, that is my takeaways from these first 6 chapters. I look forward to reading more of the book. Thank you.